Hello and welcome to the 90 Minute Fever podcast with Steve and Nick. I'm Steve, one of the admins in game, manager of Strictly Butterside Up in the Twilight FA, and Nick is the lead developer of 90 Minute Fever. Now, this is the 19th podcast in the series. It's been a little while since the last one, as Nick and the team have been just getting on with the brand new match engine. But if you're interested in the previous podcasts, they're all available on the ICON YouTube channel. Okay, in today's podcast, we are going to be discussing one of the key aspects of the new match experience in 90 Minute Fever, the changes to the tactical system and how you go about making changes within the match. We'll also quickly talk about what we are hoping for from reopening the test world in this phase and how you guys can help with testing. So, Nick, before we get on to the main topic, you've been working pretty much non-stop on the new match engine for quite some time. How do you feel about it? How's it looking?
Yeah, I feel it's looking good. From the development perspective, everything's going well. We're making lots of progress. Obviously, when you're actually using it and playing it, you tend to always focus on the weakest link, or the worst thing is the bit that annoys you the most and that stands out the most. And
yeah.
You sort that out, and then obviously then something else is now the new worst thing, and there will always be a weakest link. So it's kind of can be frustrating and annoying from the weakest part of it, and you want to sort it out. So maybe annoying behavior, or maybe something is a bit the sequence isn't you have to wait a bit long, or you don't quite see what happened or something, and you always want to make everything better, I guess, is the point. Like, no matter how good it is, it's never perfect, or it's never as good as it could be, I guess you could say. So there's that I guess it's that desire that you always want to, whenever you're working on something, you just always want to get it better and better and better. But obviously there's so many other things to work on. You can't do that for
you've got to draw a line at some point.
You do, and it's very when you're in the moment of working on it, and you just know that you could just improve it a bit more. There's always that it's always that temptation to just keep going. But yeah, all in all, I think it's going well. Obviously, it's ended up taking longer than we originally had hoped, but it's also the case that there's reasons for that, but I think one of the big one really is that the scope has increased compared to what we had originally planned to do, in that it's much more to it. It's more to all of it, more to the tactics you can make, more to the AI, more to the infrastructure part of it. It's all ended up we've ended up going sort of farther than what we had originally planned to do, and there's reasons for that, but essentially it's I guess the main one is that the gameplay will be a lot better from day one, rather than it being maybe an upgrade, but not a huge upgrade, and then improving over time. And it is something that is it's going to be there's a big decision to be made, essentially. Like, how good does it need to be in order to put it in the game? Does it genuinely, from a question perspective, like, how good does it actually have to be? And if you ask any person, it's going to be a different answer on a person by person basis. So, and if you look at for the project or for the game, it's probably another answer. It's quite complicated, let's say. You could just look at it from a very simplistic perspective, that it only needs to be better than the current match engine, let's say. But I think the answer is a lot more complicated than that, and as to it being better or not than the current match engine is also going to vary person by person on opinion as well. The answers are going to vary of how good it needs to be. I'm sure some people would say it's probably very, very, very close to being that already. When they look at the current test build, just flesh a few things out, and they probably will say it's already better than the current one. But is better enough, or does it need to be another milestone simply beyond being better? Does it need to do more than just simply be better? And then obviously on top of all of that, it's going to be improved over time significantly for a significant amount of time. It's pretty easy when we're working on this. It's pretty easy to see that we could spend another 10 years on this, something like that. and still have more to do. It's like a never-ending. The scope of what you could do with it is just huge for the match engine and for the game as a whole. So I think it is the case where, even if it isn't going to be perfect, there are going to be issues, and the reality is there always will be, no matter how much we improve it. But not sure what else to say there. Like it's just complicated, let's say, is the point I'm trying to make, as to exactly when is the exact moment that it should be used, and we have to decide that. Everyone can have an opinion, but ultimately it can't be in the game for some people and not in the game for some other people.
Of course.
It's either in the game or it isn't. So that's probably a big decision that actually, in relative timescales, it's something that is probably a near-term decision.
Okay, great. Well, let's get on to the main subject of today's podcast. Obviously, alongside this podcast, we've released the latest test build of the match engine. So I'm going to kick things off today by taking you through, give you a little bit of an insight how the new tactical system is going to work. And then Nick is going to give you some insight into the reasons it's designed the way it is. So hopefully this will give you guys a good overview so you can really get to grips with it straight away. Right, one of the big things we're trying to achieve with the new match engine is to make it a real event when you play a game. So rather than plodding through match after match, we really want to get really want users to get involved in the matches and have a real effect in the game. So for those of you who have already had a quick play with the new match engine, you'll see there are some familiar and less familiar aspects compared to the existing match engine. I mean, obviously you now see the game on the pitch rather than the commentary, so that's a pretty obvious one. But I'm talking more from a tactical perspective. You have a few tactical weapons at your disposal, if you like. Firstly, you've got a number of sliders, which we've talked about those in previous podcasts, and you guys will be pretty familiar on how those work. You'll also be able to make substitutions, move players on the pitch match in the same manner as you do now. One of the key new weapons you've got at your disposal is the ability to set individual player mentalities, and using these well is going to be key to success, we think, in this new match engine. So in the new match engine, the tactical side of the game is going to become very important. Paying attention will matter. You'll see the action unfolding in front of you, and it'll be up to you to react to what you're seeing. In the new match engine, you always pause to make your tactical changes. Each player, or each user, I should say, really, has a limited amount of tactical time to make their decisions. You make your changes during stoppages, and you see them applied on the pitch in front of you. If you run out of tactical time, effectively that's tough luck. You'll get emergency tactical time for certain events, such as sending offs or injuries. But another key change is that both users will get this extra time to allow both teams to react to the game state change this is likely to cause. The ability to think quickly and react to game state and what your opponent is doing is going to be absolutely key to doing well in the new match engine. Now, the pausing for tactical changes is a pretty big change to gameplay. So, from how quite a few people used to play. So that's really what we wanted to talk mainly about on this podcast. So I think I've blabbered on for long enough to give you a quick overview. Nick, let's go through the reasoning behind why we've made it work this way.
Yeah, I think there's also some, we could maybe discuss it after, but there's also some changes into the nature of the tactics time, pause time. Those terms are sort of synonymous as to how that actually works, how much you get, when you get it, and the emergency timeouts actually change. They don't work the same either. They work differently now as well, but can cover that after. So I think at the core part that's probably fundamentally different is the that you're only able to make the tactical changes when the match is paused, and the match can only be paused when there's a stoppage. So essentially you will request to make some tactical changes or request to have the match paused, and then when the next stoppage occurs, then the match will be paused. Then you will be able to make your tactical changes whilst it's paused, and then when you apply them or unpause the match, those changes will happen immediately, and then play will resume after the stoppage. So you'll never be in a situation where you will have some tactical changes set that aren't actually all. You'll never be in a situation where whatever you see tactically is not in regards to your slider settings or your positions for your players or anything like that. It'll never be the case that you will have something set and it won't actually be used in the match, basically. Those things will always line up to each other. There's 3 reasons for this, probably. They're sort of overlapping, so you could make it 3, maybe more, maybe less, but I think there's sort of 3 distinct parts to this. So one of them is the situation or the issue where it's probably better to just illustrate it with the current match engine because it's something that probably everybody can relate to who currently plays the game. So you make some changes, you click apply. Let's say you're winning 1-0 and there's 5 minutes left and you want to bring on an extra defender to close out the match. So you do that and you click apply and then they score and then your substitute comes on and your team is all set up defensive to hold the lead that you no longer have. Or something like you make your 3rd sub and then, whilst it's pending, a different player you have gets a knock, loses a bunch of condition, and then you have your player subbed to some other player that wasn't that one. So, and it could be yellow cards, it could be warnings, it could be anybody scoring it. In the case that it's a red card or a red injury for your team at the moment, it essentially removes the changes that you've done, reverses them, and then lets you do it again, basically. But that's the only instance. So, but it's also the case, for example, that the other team could get a red card. Arguably, that impacts you just as much tactically as it does them. For them to try to make tactical changes to make the red card sort of hurt as least as possible. It's also the case that you would want to make tactical changes yourself to try to exploit the fact that they're a man down. So you have this situation basically where if you allow tactical changes to be made when they won't be applied immediately, then something can change between when you make them and when they can be applied, which is the case at the moment. And it's, I'm sure everybody can relate to maybe everything that I've just said, all of those types of situations, and it can be really annoying, I'm sure, when that happens. So that's one of the reasons. Another one is essentially that it's going to be very important to, now you'll see the whole match, so it's definitely the case that when you get a feel for things, that for sure you can notice how the match is playing, notice where the gaps are, notice the areas of the pitch where your players tend to beat them on the dribble, and maybe on all the areas where the opposite is true. And you can change things to change the flow of the match to try to exploit, let's say, what you're noticing. You can exploit opportunities, let's say, or you can close off avenues that your team maybe was looking to possibly concede a goal, and you can close them out so that essentially you can see what's happening and you can make tactical changes, and good decisions matters, I guess you could say, a lot. So if it's the case that whatever your tactics are currently set to is exactly what's happening in the match, then it's going to be much easier to make those decisions. Whereas, let's say it was the case that you set some tactical changes and you had clicked apply, but you weren't entirely sure exactly whether they were being used in the match or not, it could potentially be a bit confusing. I think in the case of obviously existing users, they probably would, that would be less of an issue, but definitely for new users, it would be the case that whatever they see in their tactics will always be whatever's actually being used, and that is very straightforward. It's very intuitive. It's never the case that they have to understand under what circumstances and when and things like that. So that's another part of it. And then the third part, which is probably the main part, is about just a philosophical change in approach, pretty much, in that tactical changes are now treated like they are a resource, like they are, you could think of it like your turns, or you have a limited amount of actions or something like that, and you have to make them count. You have to make good decisions. You can't just, you can if you want, but it won't, you wouldn't want to just randomly do stuff just for the sake of randomly doing stuff to see what it randomly does, because you have essentially a limited amount of changes. So the decisions shouldn't be random. They should be based on some kind of educated decision, based on what you see, based on what makes sense, based on what you know. And that's part of it. The decisions will matter more. So you could think of it more like you're going to maybe make 2 or 3 changes, something like that, per half, and you just want to make the right decisions when you do it. Obviously, you have a limited amount of pause time, and if you just want to quickly change one slider setting by one increment, that might only take you a couple seconds. So you could do that lots of times. But if you want to change, positions around and individual player mentalities and all of your sliders and stuff, it's likely to take you much longer than a couple seconds, and you can probably only do that a few times per half. And then the other part to this is essentially the opposition. So if the opposition can randomly be just making changes every 3 seconds, doing random stuff, just completely changing everything every few seconds, clicking apply, then you would essentially never really, it would impair your ability to make good tactical decisions, because essentially nothing would ever be settled. Let's say if somebody's tactics is changing every 5 seconds, how are you supposed to look at the match and get some kind of understanding as to what's going on to make meaningful tactical decisions for yourself, basically? So whereas if each player is limited to essentially being able to do, say, a few bigger changes per half, then when you're watching what you're seeing and what the analysis that you're doing and the decisions you're making are all much more meaningful, basically. So I think the bigger thing is it's just fundamentally it's a change in approach where you have the tactical changes is kind of just like, it's like a resource, and it's a limited resource and you need to use it wisely, as opposed to an infinite resource that you can just do random stuff forever, till the end of the match, just over and over and over again. So it's that's probably the bigger change. And then and as a result of that, you also are closing off things like, that ties in. It's not accidental. We're saying we want the decisions to be more meaningful. The fact that now when you make a decision, it isn't going to be the case that your team will then concede a goal before the change is made. Those things tie together, very directly, right? Because your decision doesn't mean anything if you made it based on the fact you're winning 1-0, and now you've set all this stuff up to hold the 1-0 lead, and then before it's applied, you're no longer winning the match 1-0. It completely undermines everything. If you're talking about the decisions, actually, you should be paying attention and you should be trying to understand and make good decisions. The fact that everything can just change before you change, the whole match state can change after the decision is made, but before it's applied, it just undermines it all. So I think that's it, pretty much. Not sure if is there more to it, Steve? Got anything more to add there?
I don't think so. I don't think we want to throw too much information out there. It's really just to give an idea of how it's all going to work, and then just some of the reasoning behind it. I think you've gone through that pretty well. Okay, Nick. So we said we were going to talk about the changes to the pause timer interface. What do you? What's the sort of main changes and the main reasoning behind it?
Yes, I'll say I think any specifics that we mentioned now in regards to amounts of time and stuff is all TBC. So it's more the concept of how it works. So I guess the key changes is that there is no separate shared pause time blocks for both users that happen at half time, that happen when there's an emergency timeout, when one user gets a player injured or sent off. So that pause time, which was essentially sort of extra added and beyond both users pause timers. That doesn't exist anymore. So instead, what happens is when it gets to half time, it will automatically pause, but it's going to use each user's remaining pause time that they had left over when they got to half time, if that makes sense. So if you start the match, then again, these amounts of time are TBC, so I'll just put examples in, but they could end up being different. So let's say each user starts the match with 2 minutes pause time. Then when they get to half time, it will stop and it will be paused, but they'll only be able to make changes whilst it's paused, and the amount of time that they will have to pause it is whatever they had left from that 2 minutes going into half time. Or to put another way, that also means that, if you've only got 15 seconds of that left when you get to half time, then you only have 15 seconds to make changes at half time. If you have all of the 2 minutes left, then you have 2 minutes to make changes at half time.
So it's going to be a lot of time management going on here.
Yeah, absolutely. And importantly, if you have no time left, then you can make no changes. And then when the second half starts, you will get some extra pause time added for the second half, which will be, let's go 2 minutes again, but it's just an example. Let's say you get 2 minutes for each half, and at half time you can use what you had remaining of your first half pause time. So, and also it will probably be the case that there'll be a cap on the total amount of pause time. So you sort of start each half, let's say, with 2 minutes. But if you happen to get to half time, say you had a minute left and you only use 30 seconds of it, and then at the start of the second half you would get 2 minutes, but you would end up with just 2 minutes, not plus whatever you had left. If that makes sense.
I get it. So it effectively tops up back to the maximum number.
Let's say so it'd be something like that. So there maybe would be something like, and the amounts are, I'm just saying 2 minutes. I just want to make it clear. It could be a different amount, and we definitely want, it's totally pending feedback and people actually using it. Because obviously the way all of this works is that having these amounts correct is absolutely critical here, because you can only make changes if you have pause time. So we essentially need to make sure that people have, there's a reasonable amount to do what you need to do. So there's enough, but also we want it to be, we want everybody to sort of have enough, but also we want it to be the bare minimum possible.
You want people to be stretched, making quick decisions, and you don't want people wasting time.
And also you don't want people having to wait for other people.
Indeed, that's
all the time. So it would look something like you essentially get 2 minutes before the match starts, 2 minutes for the first half, 2 minutes for the second half. But as you transition from each phase to the next, you just get topped back up to 2 minutes. Something like that. And it might be the case that there's 3 minutes pre-match time to give people a bit of a chance to connect and whatever. We're not quite sure. It's like I said, it's pending. We need people's feedback. We want to get these amounts right. And then it also might be the case that when there is an emergency situation, let's say, as at the moment that is classified as getting a red injury or a red card, but it could also be reclassified to be something else. But let's say it remains the same, then potentially one user or both users will get some extra time topped back up. So let's say, for argument's sake, that if you get a red card, then at the moment what happens is you get this emergency pause time for 30 seconds that's separate and added, but instead it would automatically pause for you to do something, plus it would add 30 seconds onto your pause clock, but it would still be capped to 2 minutes probably. And it also might be the case that your opponent also gets 30 seconds added to theirs. So what it means is that there is no pause clocks outside of each user's own personal pause clock. So there'll be no additional time where it stops at half time. There will be no additional time if somebody gets a red card or something. If there is to be additional time, it's added onto the personal clock. So there's not different types of pauses, if you like. There's just simply, if it's paused, it's because you're choosing to not unpause it, and it's coming out of your personal pause time, and you can't make changes unless it's paused. So between that and the capping of, let's say it's 2 minutes maximum pause time, it essentially means that the concept of making tactical changes and pausing is a limited resource that needs to be used wisely. But also it means that if you are connected to the match and your opponent goes AFK, that you won't be waiting for them anywhere near as much as what you are at present. So, because essentially they can only have a maximum of 2 minutes pause time, so you'll never have to wait more than 2 minutes. They won't be able to accumulate it beyond that. And then the other thing that also is that we're going to be changing the nature of how it automatically pauses for people a little bit, so that it's less likely to automatically pause for someone if they are AFK. So rather than at the moment, if they've connected to the match at all, then whenever there's a stoppage, an emergency timeout or half time or whatever, then we'll then pause for them automatically until they've run out of their pause time. So it won't work that way anymore. Rather than if they've connected to the match at any point, it will be a little bit more strict, I guess you could say, than that. So it will be if they've connected to the match at any point in the last X seconds type of thing, the last 30 seconds or 15 seconds or whatever it may be. That's TBC as well. So what it means is if your opponent connected to the match but then went AFK, that as long as they went AFK at least, let's say 15 seconds before half time, then when it gets to half time it won't automatically pause for them, basically. So as soon as you're ready to go, then the second half can go. You don't have to wait for them.
Yeah, so the main thing here is users who are online and trying to play their games are going to be less impacted by other users' decisions, really. Not saying that people can't not watch their matches if they don't want to, but it doesn't impact their opponent, which is the key point, isn't it? Or not as much.
Not as much, yeah. So I guess you could say it's set up at the moment on the current way that it's set up on live is done in such a way that it gives people the maximum benefit of the doubt, or something like that. I guess you could say that if they've left, that they definitely will return, and it's all engineered that way to give them the maximum possible chance to get back and connect. But the issue with that approach is essentially that more often than not, they're not coming back, and it's actually quite rare that somebody leaves for a substantial amount of time and then actually does. I mean, substantial, more than a few seconds, let's say, because they quickly check something, or because their internet connection went a bit AWOL or something for a few seconds for them. But by and large, if somebody's left a match for, let's say, a minute, they're not coming back. The people who do are exceptions. They're not the norm at all. So rather than essentially having everything set up to be optimized to deal with a situation that very rarely happens, like you're talking less than 1% of the time, instead it's just going to be set up to give people a reasonable chance, to be reasonable, but not having people who are there, who are connected, who are playing, to constantly have to sit around waiting all the time. So I guess you could say what we've done is we've changed it, so rather than waiting for the maximum amount of possible time under all circumstances for somebody who's AFK, the approach is now being changed to, rather than waiting the maximum possible, it's instead to wait a reasonable amount of time. I guess you could say is the change in approach here, to therefore be more reasonable also to people who are actually connected, to not having to wait all the time.
Okay, makes sense. Okay, I know you've put a lot of thought into the changes to the tactics interface and the widgets and how that all works together. Would you like to explain some of the decisions made and what could be changing?
I think how it's set up at the moment is, I guess you could say, maybe, I don't know if temporary is the word, but I think what we have at the moment is just a starting point, and we definitely want to get feedback from people, just both in terms of people actually writing what they think, and also in terms of seeing how people actually engage with it. Because there is definitely some decisions to be made, and it's better that we gather that feedback about what people are actually doing, rather than trying to guess what people are going to do. At the moment, I can explain how it works at the moment and sort of the thinking there. But it doesn't. Yeah, but it doesn't mean at all that it's not going to change. I think there is every intention to change it. It's just that we don't want to change everything just based on trying to predict what people want to do. I think we want to base it on on some actual something more concrete than that. Mm-hmm. So at the moment, it's worth bearing in mind that we intend to add more and more tactical options to the new match engine over time. So that's one thing to definitely keep in mind, because it's essentially, even though it might be possible that we could put everything onto one screen at the moment for the tactics, possibly, it won't be true in the future anyway. At the moment, maybe we could somehow fit the team instruction sliders on the same screen as the
lineup tab.
The lineup tab, and maybe somehow. The problem is, obviously, even though it might fit on your screen, that everybody's got a different size screen as well. So we definitely have So even though I think for a lot of people, there's probably a gap below the list of your players in the match and the bottom of the screen, but that isn't true for everybody. And obviously, it has to work for everybody. So that's one thing to keep in mind. And then another thing to keep in mind is that even if we could sort of shoehorn it in somehow, that we want to add a bunch of other tactical instructions in the not too distant future, and that they won't fit anyway, so they're going to have to go somewhere else anyway. So we have this problem that the team instruction sliders and the list of your players and their positions on the pitch and assigning their mentalities and stuff is all that and everything else that we want to have can't all exist on the same screen at the same time. So how you access that, is up for how you how the things should be split up and how you should access the different parts is, there's, I guess you could say there's debate to be had, or, there's different ways it could be done, I guess you could say. So all I can really do is explain why it is, how it is to start with, and that we definitely intend to, have the situation under review, and it definitely could be changed. So, so at the moment, the team instruction sliders are still an overlay on the where you watch the match. So it means that even though you can't change them unless it's a stoppage, you still be able to look at what they are if it is in a stoppage, rather than having to leave to go to a different tab to check what they are and come back. And then it's also the case that if you all you want to do is just change one slider, you just have to, request, tactics to be, request a pause for the next stoppage. The stoppage happens, and then you quickly change a slider and click continue, and it's done, right? It takes you just, I don't know, a second or two or whatever. Whereas if you have to then go off to some other screen to do it, it's going to take longer. So the thinking is that there is pros to keeping the tactic sliders, especially because they're non-intrusive, basically, in that you can look at what they are without it blocking your view of the match. Mm-hmm. Whereas the formation and doing substitutes and that side of things, it's pretty much impossible to, well, without major changes anyway, but as the within the constraints of how everything is set up, it's basically impossible to be able to show that as an overlay without it blocking off without it really significantly interrupting the view of what you could see in the match. So the difference between going to a different tab to check that and not being able to see the match versus clicking an overlay to pop up, which blocks out the view of the match and not being able to see the match, there isn't really much difference there, if you know what I mean. Either way, you have to click something, and either way, you're not going to be able to see the match. So from a functionality perspective, in both cases you have to click something, and in both cases you are blocked from seeing the match. So there isn't really any much difference there. So see which approach should be done pretty much just comes down to personal preference there. And then obviously we've also want to have more tactical options in the future for set pieces and things like that. And then you have the problem that if they're also overlays, that you could really get yourself in a muddle with these overlays overlaying each other and not being able to click on what you want to click and getting yourself into a mess pretty easily. Like if you can imagine at the moment the overlay that exists in the current match engine where you change your tactics and you can do substitutions and change your formation, and then imagine that there was another 3 or 4 overlays that were that big, and you accidentally, it would be pretty easy to just get yourself in a mess basically, that you've got one showing that you don't want and trying to hide, and especially when you're under the pressure of your pause time clicking down and whatnot, versus let's say if it was just on a clearly on the tabs and you could just switch between them and you don't have to worry about, if you want to change your team instructions for the set piece, you just click on the tab and you don't have to worry about it overlapping other overlays or getting in the way and getting yourself in a muddle. So hopefully it's been done so that the stuff that is going to completely block out your view to be able to see anything in the match is done at the moment on extra tabs, and the stuff that won't will be done as overlays. That's the reasoning between how it's done. And also obviously we wanted to, it didn't seem much point to completely change everything to something that would need to be completely changed again anyway. So obviously it was also a factor in regards to, how much work was involved, because if in all likelihood we're going to, do something different and new in the future anyway, there didn't seem much point to do a bunch of extra throwaway work for the time being. So that's kind of the thinking. So the thinking is just get people's feedback, just have something in that works and get people's feedback, and then look to improve it hopefully in the future. You just need to bear in mind that the instructions and options that exist at the moment, there will be more in the future. So whatever we change it to needs to accommodate and work for having more options in the future as well.
Okay. I guess the other thing we want to talk about quickly on this call, now we've gone through that a bit, is obviously we've released the test match, the next test phase of the match engine alongside this. What kind of feedback are you hoping for in general from this phase, Nick? What would you like users to deal with? Is it a case of particularly this pausing system? You want just some good information on this?
Mostly just the tactics and the pausing system. Just try and see if you can bring back the third sub bug. See if you can just break it basically in regards to tactical changes, substitutions, pause system. Just basically this tactics system / they're intrinsically tied at the moment because you can only make tactical changes whilst it's paused. So essentially the whole system is what we really want feedback on. We just want it to be bug free, I guess you could say, when it just just works. That's the main thing at the moment. I mean, people can provide feedback on anything obviously, but in particular that's the thing that we just want to make sure is just any issues that exist, we want them all sorted out. It is something we want to just work super smooth and not have any bugs, and it's, I don't know, it's probably, if you're talking about there's obviously all sorts of things that can go wrong with the match, but if you're talking about the user client and the server and the interactions between them, just that's the part that we essentially want tested.
Yeah, it's particularly important.
Yeah, I think in regards to obviously the other parts of it, like match results, recording or league tables looking correct, and yeah, sure, feedback would be appreciated, but to some degree that's also stuff that we can test that by ourselves as well, if that makes sense. Like we can just simulate a bunch of matches and check that all the league table updated correctly. Mm-hmm. So yeah, but obviously feedback on anything, like if the player stats aren't recording and average ratings are wrong with something, or the goals aren't on their profile, or anything really, like sure, if people notice anything, any feedback would be good. But in particular, it's this whole tactics pause system, because that's just something that I'm sure there will be issues basically, and we want to identify them and we want to get them fixed. So.
Yeah, and obviously there's a number of things in the test build that are still a work in progress. Obviously, it'd be really good if people have a quick read through of the post before testing as well, just so they know what to expect. But yeah, unless you've got anything else, Nick, I think that pretty much wraps up what we wanted to cover. We just wanted to give you a quick overview of how it all works, and I think we've managed to do that. We'll post a link up to this on the forum, so if you've got anything you want to know about today's podcast, please do ask in the thread. We'll do our best to cover it. Have fun playing with the new match engine, guys. Thank you for listening, and we'll talk to you next time.